Okay, so now it's time to get this thing ready to install. So this one already has holes because I took it off of the prototype enclosure. But if you're following along, yours will not have holes yet. So we'll do the holes later, so don't worry about the fact that this one already has holes. But basically you're just going to set this in place kind of where you want it. On these big Christmas tree bins, I will shove it all the way up to the top and off to one side, but that's just my own personal preference. A couple things to keep in mind when you place this. One, you want to make sure that wherever you put it, you can actually get the screws in, and make sure that there's a spot to put screws in, right? And that it's going to be relatively easy to do so. It's also better if it's a little bit stable. You can see this one's like a little wobbly, but that's just because this thing is bent, which we'll address later. If I pull this up to where the bin matches the lid, now you can see it's stable. It doesn't, like, obviously it moves this way, but it doesn't like rock around because everything is at the same level. So that's kind of the best way to do it. Otherwise, when you tighten this down with the screws, it'll be pulled in at a weird angle and it'll cause problems. So get it set kind of where you want it. I also go all the way up to the top, make sure it's, level if you want it level. If you're using some kind of another bin, do it however you want. Basically, it really doesn't matter where this goes. Just make sure that wherever you mark is where it's actually going to go, because the next step is to cut out the hole. So if you cut out the hole and then decide you want to move it later, it's totally not worth it. That's how I ended up with a prototype. One other thing to keep in mind is the depth of your substrate, right? In here, this is like probably not even quite deep enough, but that's as deep, or that's as deep as I can make it, just because of the size, the height of the bin and everything, without like modifying the top, which could lead to some structural issues in the bin. So, but if you go too low, just keep in mind, like, your substrate can only be here at the door. Obviously you can make a hill and ramp it up, or even try to make a retaining wall behind this door, whatever. Right, but if your substrate is coming all the way up to the door, then it's going to fall out if you try to make it deeper than the door. So just something to keep in mind. So then the next thing, once it's in place, go ahead and just, like that. See how it moved? I didn't have it held still. So just kind of hold it in place, mark with the Sharpie. And then I always go, and I like to mark just a little bit on the outside edges, just to tell me where the outside edges are. And the reason for that being that I like to actually cut just a hair inside. If you go too far, then you're not going to be able to have anything to bolt it to. So you don't want to go too far, but I usually will go like 1/4 of an inch inside of this. In fact, really, you can even just freehand it. I usually use a straight edge of some kind, but I don't think I have one handy. So this will work. Use a shelf bracket because it's what I had right behind me. So we're gonna go just inside of where that door was sitting. And the reason for that is that then we won't have quite as much of a lip on it. On edges like this, where it sits right there, I always like to cut those off too, because it's sitting on this taper here, and I couldn't push it any further that way because of this rib. So I always like to cut them off just because it'll make it easier to deal with. But you totally don't have to. You can do you, you can do it however you would like. But then I'm gonna come up here. And here. Also, ignore my mess everywhere in my shop. I've got lots of projects going on, including trying to sell my shop and move my shop. So So it is a disaster in here, but okay. So we'll do that one, and then I'll go ahead and mark the other side, and we will come back to learn how to cut this thing out. Okay, so now it's time to cut this. For the eagle-eyed among you, you might notice that I flipped the tub around. That's just because of my preference. That's just because all of my others have the wheels on this side. And so I decided that I want them all to match. But it doesn't really matter which side. That's just the only reason I flipped it around. So my weapon of choice for cutting out the windows is an oscillating tool. You can use whatever you want. There's lots of good options. You don't even necessarily need to use a power tool. But this is just what I like to use because it tends to cut through things pretty quickly. And it's pretty clean when it does it. So anyway, just when you cut, a few things to remember. This plastic can get kind of brittle. These particular ones are usually pretty sturdy. Like these Christmas tree tubs are super thick plastic, so they're pretty good. But most tubs of this type, not even just the Christmas tree ones, but like any of the Sterilite or Rubbermaid tubs, are generally made out of polyethylene or polypropylene, both of which can get kind of brittle, especially in cold temperatures. So if you're working outside in a cold building like I am, because I didn't want to turn my heater on today, then just make sure that you're careful about that. So and also make sure you cut on the line that you intend to, because taking off especially just a little bit can be a real chore. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and we'll get back to it. You don't have to watch me cut it. Okay, so now this is all cut out, and you'll notice that when we push them in, now we're left with a bunch of garbage on the edge. So that's, kind of normal, especially for a power tool. It's just going to melt the plastic a tiny bit as it goes. So there's a few different tools you can use. Utility knives like these guys. I think this was 25 cents at Harbor Freight. I prefer these ones. They're Olfa brand. Olfa makes a really good utility knife and lots of good cutters just in general. So if you use something like this, the one thing to be careful of is if you cut at the wrong angle, it'll dig in and gouge the plastic. So you want to just kind of like hold it at a really slight angle. So that being said, what I actually prefer to use instead of a utility knife for this particular process is a thing called a burr whip, or a deburring tool. And it actually holds it takes some getting used to, but it holds the blade at just the right angle, so that as you're pulling along, and mine's getting a little bit dull, but then it holds the blade at the right angle so that now everything is nice and clean. It didn't gouge the plastic. It's not sharp anymore, and that kind of thing. So I'll just go ahead and do this to the whole rest of it. One other thing, so make sure you do this inside and out, and inside real quick. Something else to consider is maybe taking a tiny bit of like sandpaper or a sanding sponge or something and just lightly hitting this edge. This particular part is something that your reptile can actually get to, right? They'll have access to this edge because it'll be right up next to the door. And if they are like any other reptile and like to tank surf occasionally, then they are going to be right up against these things. So make sure that they're nice and rounded on the edges. Like I'm not gonna cut myself on that, right? Like I don't think I could, even if I tried. So just make sure that everything is nice and cleaned up. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, one quick note about some of these tools that I'm using. The deburring tool, or burr whip as I call it, they're available at like Home Depot and Lowe's and that kind of thing, right? You'll find them in the plumbing section. A lot of the times they're used to deburr the ends of plastic pipe. And so they do, I think they're like $10. They're not super expensive, right? But if you're only going to use it for this project, maybe not worth it. Also, another thing, the sharper the blade, the less chance there is that you're going to shatter the plastic on this thing, or otherwise damage it, and also the less chance that you're going to hurt yourself with it. I know that seems counterintuitive, but a sharper knife means that you don't have to put as much force on something as you're cutting it. And if you're putting too much force, then it's more likely to slip, right? Kind of like what it was doing before. It was like skipping. So these burr whips actually have a spare blade in the back. This is the blade that was there when I started the video. Most of them have a spare blade in there, and you can buy new blades. So if you feel like you're fighting it, especially if you're like borrowing the tool, then odds are it's just a dull blade, and just try replacing the blade. And now you see how much cleaner that goes. Another thing, the corners can be difficult to get to. So just a little razor scraper like this guy. This is a 3D printed handle for a blade. I don't actually have the real ones, but you can buy the real ones at like even the dollar store or something like that. And these can be nice just for like gently trimming a corner like that, right? To get the gunk out, especially if you used some kind of a power tool. If you used like a jigsaw or something like that, you'll get these little like balls of melted plastic that are actually, they're not like sharp, but they definitely wouldn't be comfortable for a little guy to rub on all the time. So just kind of, you know, gently and carefully scrape away those corners. Didn't quite get that one on the inside. And then, nice, beautiful. And then another thing, like I said, I like to use sanding sponges just to kind of clean up all the edges and make sure everything's nice and round. If you don't know what I mean by round, imagine like the lip of a soda bottle, right? When you open up a plastic soda bottle, the edge of it isn't super sharp or you'd cut your lips on it. So it's kind of rounded on the edges, right? And that's what you want here. So when you go to sand, kind of sand head on, but then go at like, 45 in either direction, kind of roll it a little bit. And that'll create that rounded edge so it's nice and smooth, so that nobody can get hurt on it, including and especially your reptiles. So next thing is these corners, right? It's a good idea to just use the corner of a sanding sponge down in there. You can use sandpaper for these. The only reason I like the sanding sponges for these is that it conforms to the shape, number one, and number two, with a really sharp, I say sharp, with a fine edge like this. If you're using sandpaper, you'll wear out a spot in the sandpaper really, really fast, and it'll also heat it up, and that's uncomfortable to me. So I like to just use a sanding sponge. They're super cheap. Again, if you want, you can get it at Dollar Tree. This is not an ad for Dollar Tree. I just happen to shop there a lot. But you can also get them at like Walmart, Harbor Freight, obviously like Home Depot or Lowe's, right? They're cheap if you get them. Well, depending on where you get them, they're cheap. They don't have to be amazing either for this particular job, right? Some sanding sponges are made to do metal. We're not sanding metal, obviously, here. So it can be a super cheap one. The dollar store ones work just fine for this. They do come out a tiny bit cheaper at Harbor Freight, if you're a Harbor Freight shopper. But if not, that's okay. And if you really only need the one, then there's no reason to go buy a pack of 10 at Harbor Freight. So anyway, so now this is all rounded up, and we'll get ready to set the door on it. So we're getting ready to set this door, and one thing to note, this is when it really matters, where is up, right? So remember how we had those different depths of channel. Make sure that your shallower channels or your shallower channel between these two is on the bottom, because you want that door to push up and then slide back down and be captivated by this top. So make sure that you have the deeper channel on top, the shallower channel on the bottom. Other than that, it doesn't really matter. Pick whichever face you think looks best. Again, mine has holes in it right now because I pulled this one off of something else. I usually drill the holes elsewhere. I'll cover that in a second. But make sure, just whichever face you think looks best. In this case, I've already gotten, that. Don't worry too much about getting Sharpie on stuff. Sharpie is not as permanent of a marker as some people are led to believe. So don't worry too much if you get Sharpie on something. as I like to say in my shop, if the good Lord had intended for anything to be permanent, he wouldn't have invented angle grinders. So really, I mean, we're not going to use an angle grinder on Sharpie, but a little bit of rubbing alcohol will take that off and not damage anything else. So don't worry too much about it, but whichever face looks best to you, go ahead and use. So the way I like to do this is using a little bit of double-sided tape. If you are going to leave the tape on, then at this point, just, you know, make sure that you put it somewhere that your reptile won't be able to get to it. You can use really any kind of double-sided tape. Does not matter. This is just to hold it in place. And you really can take it back off when you're done. Some people would probably insist on it. With this one, like, by the time it's bolted in, these sides are so inflexible with the bolts and everything that, like, I don't think a reptile could hurt themselves on it. And if they did get in there, they would hurt themselves far more on the, yeah, don't follow this example. That's a really dangerous way to cut tape. They would hurt themselves far more by squeezing into this really tight little gap than they would on the tape. So I'm not probably going to remove this unless it's exposed on the inside, but that's how I like to do it. And then again, make sure that the channel is on the top, get it all set to the point where you want it. I'm actually going to probably put a clamp here to hold this thing together so that when I'm doing this, they are held in place. Yeah, like that. And then peel this tape off. Again, you don't have to use the double-sided tape, and you can always take it back off. You don't have to use anything special. It's really up to you. The reason that I do it is because then it makes it easier to get the holes drilled. You can just drill straight into, or straight through the door frame and into the bin, through the bin, all in one shot, rather than having to like measure things and stuff like that. So that's why I do it. Do it however you would like. I'll just squeeze that to set that tape. Yeah, and in this case, you can't see the tape and it's not exposed on the back side, so I'm probably not even going to take it back off, but we'll see. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Now we'll do the other side. Okay, hello and welcome to the other side. So this one is obviously the other door. I wanted to clarify something really quick. There we go. I wanted to clarify something really quick. The reason I'm not going to take this tape off, like I said, is because it's not exposed here. It's not exposed here, and by the time everything is done, like you can see, I mean, this plastic is heavy. Like to get a gap in there, and there's going to be a bolt here, a bolt here, a bolt here, and then 3 on the bottom, right? So to get this plastic bent enough, like there would have to be a really good amount of force on this. That said, I'm not taking the tape off because a ball python is going in this, an adult female. She's like 4.5 feet long or something. I don't remember how long she is, but you know, she's a good size. There's no way she's gonna push her way into there. However, I do have a corn snake and a bull snake, and both of those could do that. They still have doors like this, but they're in something else that doesn't have these little gaps and that kind of stuff, right? If I were building this for them, I would totally take that tape off, and I would probably put a few more bolts and things in there, and maybe even some insulating foam to seal the whole thing up. So just wanted to clarify that. You know, adhesive is a terrible thing in enclosures, so don't do that if you think there's any chance they could get in contact with it. But in this case, my little lady cannot. There's no way she could get in there. So I'm not going to worry about it. Anyway, so now I've got this one set. We came over here because this one doesn't have the holes in it, so we're going to work on doing the holes. Okay, this is the part of the show where we set the holes. So like I said, I use metric hardware. It doesn't really matter. I use metric hardware and standard drill bits because I'm an American, and when it comes to units, we do what we want. So basically I'm gonna just mark these out and go like halfway through. So what? That's like 1.5 inches wide. And I'm gonna punch holes for the center point, and then I'll come back and drill them. The reason I do that is because the drill bit is gonna have a tendency to walk. Now I'm gonna use a punch. You totally don't have to use a punch. Like you can use a pen on this stuff, at least. You can use a pen, you can use a screwdriver. It really does not matter. What? 17 1/4. What's half of that? 14 1/8. Or not, no, 17. I can't do math, clearly. I won't even edit that part out. I'll just leave that there for someone else to enjoy. Yeah, 17 1/4. Is half of that would be what? 16 1/2, 16 5/8. Or no, 8. Wow, 8 5/8. I really cannot do math and talk at the same time. 8 5/8 is our halfway point. So I'm gonna come in here. And actually, first off, I'm just gonna draw a mark. I'm at 8 5/8. Boop. That's going to be my center point. And then let's center it this way real quick at the 3/4 mark. Boop. And then we will punch it. So I'm just going to do one hole first and just kind of show you, and then I'll go do the rest of them by myself. Like I said, I'm using an actual like center punch for this. You can totally use like a screwdriver or whatever. Really, the idea is just to keep the drill bit from walking too far on you. As you drill, this stuff is super soft, but the bin is much harder. You're going to want to slow down when you get to the bin and hold it against the back, but make sure you don't, drill through your finger or anything. But if you try to push too hard through it, you're going to pop a hole or like crack it. You'll crack the bin on the back side, and that would be no good. So, so just be careful of that. And then the next thing I do, this is totally optional, I feel like, but I'll show you anyway. I take a small countersink to round off that hole, and then I do the same thing on the inside just to keep this hole from getting too gummed up with stuff before I have a chance to put the screw in there. And then when I put the screw in, like I said, use whatever you got. Use whatever the heck you want, right? This is what I use. Make sure whatever it is something that's not going to like rust or corrode sitting in a humid environment. But then I go like that, and I put a nylock nut and a washer on the back side. I also like to make sure that my nylock nuts are just the right length that the end of the screw won't protrude out from them. So that it gets a nice good bite all the way through the threads into the nylon, but doesn't come out the other side. That way it's nice and smooth on the back side. So there's that. I'll go ahead and do the rest of these. Okay, so just to show you an inside view of what I did in here, just a quick round with a countersink bit to take off all the junk, and this is primarily just to help the screws sit flush. Also helps to, actually let the bit do its job and take off the material. Anyway, so then from there, to show you this and show you what I'm talking about here, we'll take this little nylon lock nut and our screw. We'll run our screw straight through here and then gently put this on. And in this case, it looks like I might need an extra washer, but I can't tell. Yeah, I'm gonna need an extra washer on the inside here. So basically use washers as shims. so that, got that stuck. Pliers might have been overkill for this job, but that's what was right at hand, so it was fine. So use washers as shims so that once you get everything set, you can see now, and I'll tighten that down just a little bit, but you can see that the screw doesn't protrude through here, right? It's not sharp. I'll try to show you an example of what I'm talking about here. Let's see if I can get this camera to focus. Oh yeah, look at that, that was beautiful. Okay, so here, except my hands aren't strong enough. Oh, actually that's perfect. So you can see, if you look at my ugly fingers, but right here, you see how this is just flush, right? It's just hanging out right there. It doesn't stick all the way through. And the reason for that is that this is nice and smooth. The end of the screw is not so much smooth. The end of the screws tend to be kind of sharp. They might have little burrs of metal and stuff on them. You can actually see right there, this one's got a super sharp one. So your options are to basically file these down to round them out, or to just use a washer to shim up the screw so that the lock nut doesn't go. Oh, there we go. So the lock nut doesn't sit so far down that the end of the screw protrudes. Anyway, that's basically it. So now the glass will pull up and slide into there. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video because it's already a half-hour long, and that's ridiculous. I apologize. But once I get these other screws in here on both sides, that's it for the doors. So anyway, there is that for anyone who was curious. Thanks for watching.